Good afternoon and welcome to the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for joining us today for today's event, Global Foresight 2024. What will the next decade bring? My name is Jenna Ben-Yehuda. I'm Executive Vice President here at the Atlantic Council, and I'm delighted to welcome you to what I think will be a fascinating hour together with our colleagues. As we all know, the world is reckoning with so much turbulence, ranging from conflicts in Europe and the Middle East to the growing threat of climate change and to new disruptive technologies such as AI and quantum computing. So how will these and other phenomena shape the world in the next decade and beyond? Well, fear not, because to answer that question, the Atlantic Council's Foresight team has produced Global Foresight 2024, which is the third annual report by this name. The report examines the drivers of change that will shape the world in coming years. And one of the report's three key pieces is a survey of global strategists and foresight practitioners to better understand the biggest drivers of global change out to the year 2034. The second annual survey gathered responses from nearly 300 experts in the world, around the world. The Atlantic Council promotes constructive leadership and engagement in international affairs based on the Atlantic community's central role in meeting global challenges. The Council provides an essential forum for navigating the dramatic economic and political changes defining the 21st century by informing and galvanizing its uniquely influential network of global leaders. The Atlantic Council, through the papers it publishes, the ideas it generates, the future leaders it develops, and the communities it builds, shapes policy choices and strategies to create a more free, secure, and prosperous world. So convenings on topics such as this are also integral to the Scowcroft Center's mission of developing sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the U.S. around the world. And the center, of course, honors General Brent Scowcroft's legacy of service and embodies his ethos of nonpartisan commitment to the cause of security, support for U.S. cooperation with allies and partners, and certainly dedication to the mentorship of the next generation of leaders. So as part of this mission, the Scowcroft Strategy Initiative from the Center is delighted to use today's launch to launch our annual Global Foresight 2024 report. The findings from this year's report, as always, are fascinating and diverse, ranging across geopolitics, economics, technology, ecology, demography, society, and so much more. So to explain the survey in more depth, I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Peter Engelke, Deputy Director and Senior Fellow for Foresight with the Scowcroft Center, and non-resident Senior Fellow with the Global Energy Center. Once again, thank you so much for being with us here in person and online, and I'll turn it over to Peter for a discussion of the report, the survey results, and an introduction to all that lies ahead. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jenna, and for the kind introduction, and welcome everyone here in the building as well as online to today's event. As Jenna said, my name is Peter Engelke, and I am the Deputy Director and Senior Fellow for Foresight within the Scowcroft Center here at the Atlantic Council, as well as a non-resident Senior Fellow with our Global Energy Center. At the Scowcroft Center, I lead the team that puts together our annual Global Foresight report that Jenna, of course, mentioned and that you're all here to hear us talk about today. Now in its third year, our annual Global Foresight report is intended to be a capstone assessment of where the world is now and where it might be going in the future. The report is intended to be thematically and geographically broad, as well as rich in creative content, and I think Jenna emphasized that in her opening remarks. And of course, all of us hope that you will take a moment to read it and digest it, and that you will find that the report matches the description that I just gave. As in previous years, Global Foresight 2024, again, the third version of our report, consists of three main elements. The first is a set of top risks and opportunities for the coming year, for 2024. The second is a set of so-called snow leopards, which is a phrase that we coined in my shop. Snow leopards are under-the-radar phenomena that have the potential to have outsized impacts in the years to come. And third is a survey of experts from around the world about what the world might look like in the year 2034, so 10 years from now, hence Foresight. This year's top risks and opportunities list, in other words, the one focusing on the year 2024, explores risks such as the conflict in Gaza spreading to the wider Middle East, or the possibility that China might blockade Taiwan. And it also explores opportunities such as the chance that democracy around the world might actually enjoy a renaissance, or the potential that the space economy might take off, which is, of course, a pun, and I intended it to be that way. The 6 snow leopards are known but underappreciated phenomena, just like the cat that lives in the wild, something that's a bit hidden. We know it exists, but it's a bit hidden. Underappreciated phenomena that might have the power to reshape the world. Snow leopard spotting has become a bit of a part of how we at the Scowcroft Center peer into the future, and it represents, I think, our most creative take on phenomena that don't always get enough attention, but should get more attention. So our next generation analysts, in other words, our young people in the Scowcroft Center this year, identified this year's list of 6 snow leopards, and they kept their eyes on all kinds of interesting things, ranging from Antarctic geopolitics, not Arctic, Antarctic geopolitics, to missile proliferation to super reflective white paint, of all things. And of course, Global Foresight's final component is our expert survey. And this year we surveyed almost 300 experts from around the world to poll their thinking on everything from geopolitics and conflict to ecology and climate change to technological disruption to the future of democracy and a few other things too. So a wide-ranging survey of experts from around the world. And I encourage, of course, all of you here in the audience, as well as our viewers online, to explore these results, which are many. They are insightful, and they are, of course, rich in detail. So before turning over to our panel, I'd like to take a moment to highlight just 3 of the survey's many key findings, which viewers, of course, can find at the Global Foresight 2024 page on the Atlantic Council's website. The first slide, which you can see here, shows responses to what we call a gut check question. Namely, do you think the world a decade from now will be better off or worse off than it is today? This is the first time that our survey team has included this question in the survey. Like similar questions that you might find from public opinion surveys that might ask about, for example, consumer sentiment in the world, our intention with this question is to gauge how the world's geostrategists feel, in other words, the gut, how they feel about where the world is headed. And we think the results here are really interesting, which is that, frankly, their gut says we're not feeling too good about things. In other words, about 60% said the world will be worse off in 2034 than it is today. So an important question for us, and I think the panel will discuss this, why would the majority of experts feel this way about the world 10 years from now? So the second slide, I'd like to show you is this question that we asked, which shows responses to one of our questions about geopolitical power, specifically to a question about whether the United States will remain the world's dominant power in the year 2034. And as you can see, a majority say yes, the U.S. will still be the world's dominant power, at least in the military, the technological, and the economic domains. And here you can see that the overwhelming majority of experts, over 80%, said that the U.S. will be the world's dominant military power, with slightly smaller majorities saying the same for technological innovation and for economic power. And of course, it's important to also note that the however here is that only about a third of respondents said that the U.S. will remain the world's dominant power in the diplomatic arena. And I should note again before going to the final slide that I want to highlight that this is just one of several survey questions in the survey that focus on the domain of geopolitics and power. And finally, a third slide, if we can bring that up, asks respondents to tell us what the single biggest threat to global prosperity will be in 2034. And we think this is a really interesting finding and a slightly counterintuitive, but perhaps not, which is that by far the largest percentage, 37%, said climate change will be the single biggest threat to global prosperity, far outpacing the prospect of major power conflict, far outpacing the demographic trends, which in my interpretation would be aging primarily, and well outpacing the others on this list, which include debt, technological disruption, and another global pandemic, which itself is very interesting. That only got 1.9% of responses from the survey. So in sum, I would like to repeat that our report this year, as it did in previous years, has many, many fascinating findings across a wide variety of topics. We designed it to be that way. We designed it to be not only a creative document that would stimulate thinking, but also range across all of the things that we need to take seriously in the world. Whether we're talking about geopolitics, conflict, technology, social movements, which we survey about in this survey, ecology, and a whole lot more. So our panel, which is with us today, will discuss some of these issues in more detail, and I would now like to introduce Felicia Schwartz, who is the U.S. Foreign Affairs and Defense Correspondent at the Financial Times, who will moderate today's panel. So Felicia, over to you.
Thanks so much, Peter, and welcome everyone. First, to my right, we have Yuri Friedman. He is the Senior Editorial Director at the Atlantic Council, who helped analyze the findings of the survey. And then to my left, we have Yasmina Byrne. She is the Chief of Foresight and Policy at UNICEF. And then to her left, we have Ria Strasser-Galvez, who's the Head of Foreign Policy Partnerships at Google. And thanks again for being with us today. So just to kick it off and to reference what Peter said, the survey predicts a lot of doom and gloom. Yuri, starting with you, what did experts indicate in this survey to make them feel so gloomy about 10 years from now? And then tell us a bit more broadly about why you undertake this project. When so much could change in 10 years, why ask people so far out?
Precisely because so much can change in 10 years that we do it. So first on the question, this was an effort, as Peter mentioned, to kind of do almost like a business consumer index before the global outlook. And the desire was to say, okay, do people think, the arc of human affairs is long, but it bends toward a better world? Will the future generations experience better life than current generations do, or not? And we wanted to find that out. And, the baseline finding, we plan to ask this every year, is not the most optimistic, right? 60% say they think the world will be worse off, and that held across different demographic groups, which was an interesting finding. But we'll keep tracking this and see, where is sentiment trending. More broadly on why we do this, Foresight, as part of this package, we did a thing on top risks and opportunities in the year ahead, and Peter and our colleague Paul Saffo did an excellent job with that. But Foresight is best practice as kind of a discipline over the longer term, and 10 years is a particularly potent time frame. There's a great Defense Department memo from 2001 period by this Defense Department official where he talks about, he goes through from the year 1900 to the present, to the at that time the present day, and says how the world changed every decade. So in 1980, the U.S. was worried about being vulnerable to Russia, and it was the biggest creditor nation. By 1990, we were 1 year away from the collapse of the Soviet Union. The U.S. was the biggest debtor nation. No one had heard of the internet. 2000, internet's taken the world by storm. Poland is part of NATO. His point is, he's not sure. His point was he was not sure what the next decade will look like, but he's sure that it'll look different than what we can imagine. So let's plan accordingly. And we want to look 10 years out because we know there's going to be transformational change, and we want to be able to understand what that could possibly look like. And the last thing I'll say is there's a common misperception that foresight is about prediction, and it's not. The future is not fixed. Forecasts are not destiny. What we're trying to do is, through this survey, is get from our experts a sense of possible futures. And the other thing to point out, one of the reasons why we want to do foresight as an exercise is because humans have agency. Policymakers have agency, political leaders, the broader public, they have agency in shaping these potential futures. And looking at them gives us a sense to know, okay, what are the undesired outcomes we want to avoid? And what are the desired outcomes we want to help realize? And that's our goal with the survey.
Great. And Yasmina, turning to you and thinking about children specifically, do you think that they will be better or worse off by 2034? And do you share the doom and gloom that many of the experts polled indicated?
Well, it's very hard to say. Let me start with a positive and looking back. When we look at the results for children since 2000, there has been a remarkable progress, 60% reduction in child mortality, for example. Immunization rates have gone up. Child poverty has been reduced, and the trajectory, if we continue on that trajectory, we'll see even more reduction of child poverty. But that progress for children has been uneven because many countries in the world are still lagging behind. The least developed countries are far away from achieving SDGs, which are by 2030 close to your date of 2034. And every time there are shocks in the world, like COVID or conflict in Ukraine and so on, that kind of reduces chances of positive outcomes for children. We've seen that with the reduction of poverty because the trajectory has changed. And because of COVID and uneven recovery due to COVID, 15 more million children annually will live in extreme poverty up to 2030. So to echo what Yuri was saying, it really depends on whether that future is going to be doom and gloom or is it going to be positive on the choices we make today, on the policy choices we make. And we have also recently published our own Prospects for Children report maybe 3 days ago. We collaborated with Peter and his team at Atlantic Council on this report where we actually look at various scenarios that will help us reach this desired future and through enhanced collaboration and cooperation between various different actors. So I'm afraid it's not yes or no answer, but really we all have a role to play to make the right choices to make that future for children brighter.
And Ria, just picking up on something Yuri said as well, just thinking about the ways that technology has impacted us in the past 2 decades, for example, in ways that maybe no one would have ever predicted, with that humble kind of thought in the back of your minds. How important do you think it is to get technology policy right in this next decade, and how are you kind of feeling about the next 10 years?
Yeah, thanks, Felicia, and congratulations to the Atlantic Council for a really impactful report here, and thanks for having me to talk about digital policy and recognizing what I think is becoming more clear, that digital policy is really a key part of foreign policy increasingly. And yes, exactly as Yuri mentioned, in the last decade, we've seen a huge shift to digitization, an acceleration of that with COVID. We all have an incredible access to information just in our phones, but also now we have access to compute power through cloud, to analysis through AI. And technology is increasingly a factor in geopolitics. It's a huge part of national security, of economic policy and trade. And we see this in how the foreign policy apparatus is structured and being restructured. For example, the State Department now has their Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy that an ambassador is leading. We see many foreign ministries now reorient to have tech ambassadors or foreign ministers of digital. And so it's important that we pay attention to the trends and the threats that are coming up in digital policy. And I'll raise 2 to you all today that are concerning. Number 1 is that freedom online is in decline. Freedom House puts out a wonderful report, the Freedom on the Net report, and in their most recent one, they identified that for the past 13 years, freedom has been on decline in many countries. And what this means in practice is that there's over 50 countries that are pursuing rules on content, on data, on competition that really subdue free expression and allow greater access to private data. And this is especially concerning in the context of all the important international elections we're about to see and have already seen globally this year. Countries are doing things like pursuing criminal liability just against content that they don't want to see online. We've seen this with Russia. And this limits citizens' access to information and their ability to participate in the democratic process. So that's one huge concern and trend that we see, and hopefully we can pay attention to and try to thwart in the next 10 years. The second one I want to bring up is fragmentation of digital regulation. Over the last year, we've seen somewhat of a move away from the last 20 years of consensus that we need to support an open internet and work on this together. We've seen rules that nationalize and fragment the internet, doing things like adopt protectionism and make it hard for international companies to work in specific countries. And we see this even in some of our democratic allied countries as well. It's not just the usual suspects that are difficult. And we also see things like cloud and data localization, which may be coming from a place looking for security, but actually is creating scenarios where cybersecurity is difficult to achieve if you're requiring data be in just one location. So these are concerning trends in digital, which, like I mentioned, just spreads even beyond to national security and economics and trade. And it's all the more concerning when you're very optimistic, as I am, which I hope to be able to speak about my optimism a bit later, about what tech and what AI can do to solve some of our world's biggest problems.
Putting on my news junkie hat for a second, I've been spending much of the last few months thinking about the Middle East, or really much of the last decade of my professional career. And I thought that there were some very interesting findings in the survey about where the Middle East might end up in the next 10 years. So one of the findings that stuck out to me, and this is what I covered in the article that I wrote about this survey last week, and Yuri, I'll turn this to you. I was pretty surprised by how upbeat people were on the prospects of normalization between Israel and Saudi Arabia. I guess my colleagues had some good reporting on that this morning, so perhaps I shouldn't have been so surprised. But tell us why you chose to kind of dive in on that in the survey, and then also the survey found that 1 in 5 people, still a minority, but to quote Peter, an important one nonetheless, who they said they thought that Israel and an independent Palestinian state would have normalized ties in the next 10 years. That feels very far away to me, but tell us about these findings and what it says about this moment of change in the Middle East.
Yeah, we wanted to ask about Israel and its relationship with its neighbors because at the in the moment of a crisis, and obviously it's a huge news story, it can be hard to see beyond the day-to-day and the week-to-week. But here we have this 10-year horizon, so let's ask something that might surprise people potentially. And I was struck by both of those findings too. On the Israeli-Palestinian finding, yes, a small minority, but it suggests kind of an alternative reading of the current devastation, which is that maybe this is as inconceivable as it may seem at the moment. Maybe this is a crucible through which something better could emerge. On the Israeli-Saudi normalization, that also was surprising because there's been this feeling that has been knocked off course. Maybe that was even the intended outcome, that Hamas and its patron Iran didn't want Israel-Saudi normalization to proceed, and that might have been one of the motivations behind the October 7th terrorist attack. And yet we found that 50% of respondents thought that would be the case in 10 years. I think one thing I want to point out, there's a connection between the two. Actually, the head of the Atlantic Council, Fred Kemp, had a piece that see the two as linked and think that as part of Israeli-Saudi normalization, which they want to prioritize, you would have a pathway to a Palestinian state as well, which some people find hard to imagine right now with the current Israeli government, but that would be the goal. And we've even seen at Davos, at the World Economic Forum, Jake Sullivan, National Security Advisor, suggested that the two could be linked. As you mentioned, the Financial Times is reporting that there may be an Arab push to link Saudi and Israeli normalization to the Israeli-Palestinian two-state solution. So this could happen, as crazy as it may seem now, and it could happen even. We have 10 years out, but there's a lot of push to do this urgently as a means of ending the current conflict and coming to something better. One last thing I'll note is that there's an interesting discrepancy, given they're linked, between 60% saying Israeli-Saudi normalization will happen and only 20% saying Israeli-Palestinian conflict will result in normalized relations, considering that policymakers are linking the two. But you could read it potentially as that normalization happens while there's a pathway, but it hasn't been realized yet. But very, very compelling findings in the current moment.
And then, Yasmina, to turn to you, but to take a step back, at least in the next year or two, it seems like there are two massive conflicts, one in the Middle East, one between Russia and Ukraine, that, I mean, maybe some others in the room are more optimistic about where they might go, but just looking ahead to the next 10 years, at this moment of turmoil and crisis, how do these particularly wide-scale conflicts affect, without any foreseeable end right now, how do they affect children in particular? How do children and their development suffer as the world struggles to address these conflicts?
Yeah, and I would thank you for pointing this very important thing, that because conflicts really are still the biggest threat to children's well-being, and not only the two conflicts that you mentioned, there are many forgotten conflicts like Yemen and Sudan, and for years they've been taking huge toll on children's life and suffering. UNICEF data shows that about 460 million children either live in conflict-affected areas or are fleeing from conflict-affected areas. That's 500 million. Children in the world, and the nature of warfare nowadays is bringing additional risks to children. So the way the conflicts are waged, the urban warfare, use of explosive weapons, use of drones, about 50% of victims of explosive weapons are children. And even if and that's just from the impact from the fighting. If we think about any kind of secondary impact that the conflicts that you mentioned could have on children, they can have impact not only on children in those countries, but in neighboring countries and worldwide. We take the conflict in Ukraine, for example. It seriously affected food supply chains, and that negatively affected food security and nutrition of children in many countries. And some of the analysis we did also shows how many more children were at risk of malnourishment because of that. But even if all the conflicts end tomorrow, the long-term effect of the conflicts will be felt for many, many years because of the loss of schooling. We've seen that during COVID that just recovery from the loss of education took a couple of years for many of children who couldn't go to school during that. Mental health toll that children undergo through these situations and conflict and displacement and having to flee. So I think this is, in a way, one of the moments when we have to stop and think what we are doing to younger generations by trying to find solutions to these conflicts that go on and on and on and really damage potentially damage generations of children to come.
I want to turn now to another finding that Peter highlighted, which is that a plurality of the experts surveyed agreed that climate change, more than anything else, will be the biggest disruptor by 2034. And Ria, I want to bring you back in here and ask you, how do you think that digital solutions, good technology policy could, help heed off this threat of climate disruption predicted here?
Well, I'm very happy to be able to answer this question, be a bit more optimistic, bring this panel to some optimism here, because I'm really looking forward to what technology has been doing and can do to address our climate crisis. At Google, we've been asking ourselves for the entirety of the company's existence how we can do things like operate 24/7 carbon-free energy. How can we use technology to help people make better, more informed choices that are sustainable? And globally, we're seeing progress towards a sustainable future, but what we really need to see is an accelerated progress. And that's where I'm very optimistic about what AI can do to help us accelerate what we're already working so hard on. Google's committed to the Paris Agreement because we know we need to turn the corner in our sustainability by 2030. So even sooner than this report is looking at, we need to make some very big moves. And digital solutions are helping people and companies and countries to make informed decisions. I'll give a few examples that are some Google examples. Google Maps is a product that is used by billions of people, so incredible scope and potential impact. And since 2021, we've had fuel-efficient routing, which is estimated to have done the equivalent of taking 500 million cars off the road every single year through more efficient routes. It's something that I use, and I hope that many of us can choose to use to be more sustainable. Another really interesting tool is the Environmental Insights Explorer, which uses AI and satellite imagery to help calculate useful things. My favorite one is the rooftop solar potential, which looks at things like sunshine exposure, weather patterns, and roof dimensions, and allows people and businesses to better install solar. But there's also global climate crises that are coming up increasingly because of climate change. And advanced AI and analysis can help us deal and help save people's lives and save economies, economic impact of these. So a few examples are on flood prediction. Google has a flood hub platform that's used in more than 80 countries, and it helps predict floods up to 6 days ahead of time, which is incredibly important to save lives and allow small businesses to prepare. And it's been very exciting to see the expansion of this type of predictive analytics. And now we're looking into see how this can be applied for wildfires. And this has been used to predict around 30 wildfires based mostly in the US and Canada, now expanding to Mexico and parts of Australia. So those are just some examples of how technology can help in consumer products, but also can help in protecting against the crises that we know are going to come up. And the private sector can also lead the way in terms of leading by example in terms of our own business and our own decisions that we make. So Google uses AI to manage energy usage in our data centers to ensure that we are prioritizing when clean energy is available. And we've also committed to making clean energy purchases, and our goal is to reach 100% carbon-free by 2030. So I'm glad to see many other businesses making these types of commitments. At COP was a very exciting moment. And I continue to think that AI and digital technologies are going to be a really key part to solving this very important climate crisis that has been outlined by this report.
And Yasmina, the experts polled also, while they were very nervous about the prospect of climate change and how it could be disruptive, they also indicated that they saw the greatest chance for global cooperation. So how do you think global institutions can deliver for children specifically, and how does climate change particularly affect them?
Well, there are two questions here. One is how does climate change affect children, and it can affect them on many different ways. So in every way that it can affect all of us through diseases, air pollution. Children are even more susceptible to these risks than adults. Forced displacement, I mentioned it in the context of conflicts, but we should also be mindful that many communities are migrating because of the climate risks as well that affect children and their families. So institutions like ours can do a lot. Obviously, UNICEF has been incredibly active in international fora with advocating for inclusion of child-related provisions into documents and global agreements. This is an area where there's a lot of concern by many international actors. But I would say that it's not only the responsibility of international fora and international organizations to deal with the effects of climate change. It's all of us. We all have a shared responsibility, including private sector. I'm so happy to hear all these great examples coming from Google. And perhaps on a positive note to say that young people, children and young people are particularly passionate about climate change, and they are really important actors in addressing the impacts of climate change, and we shouldn't forget to include them in our conversations, in decisions about what can be done. They need our support. They're well organized. We've seen that also at COP28, where young people's delegations were everywhere. But we can't expect them to be the only ones who are going to be solving this challenge for us and saving the planet for future generations. So again, how do we support young people to continue this fight for a better future for all of us?
All right, sorry, Ria, to pivot back to a little bit more doom and gloom. The respondents overall had a pretty negative view of social media, but a somewhat positive view of artificial intelligence, which perhaps squares with where you've landed. I guess I will turn to Yuri to kind of, maybe you can just flesh out for us a little bit about these interesting divisions over artificial intelligence and where they landed and what you think that says.
Yeah, if we've gotten a consistent, if we've gotten a consistent message across, two surveys asking about social media in particular, it is that people are really negative about where it's headed, which may not surprise people so much. On artificial intelligence, I was a little surprised because there's been so much talk about, how will, chat GPT like products lead eventually to killer robots and all those kinds of conversations, right, in the last year or two. And yet people were reasonably optimistic about artificial intelligence, certainly more so than social media, though that's a low bar. But one thing we found is there were differences among demographic groups. The private sector was more bullish, more positive on artificial intelligence than other groups. The one that we found most interesting is that those over 50 years old tended to be more optimistic about the impact, the net, impact that artificial intelligence will have on global affairs. Thinking on balance, it would be positive, whereas those under 50 were more pessimistic. And also, interestingly, talking about regulation, younger respondents were more likely to cite technology governance as the area for greatest expansion of global cooperation, which kind of signals that, if not concerned, at least they think more governance needs to happen. And I'm curious what everyone here thinks about that finding and how to interpret it. But one thing, we were debating a couple different theories. One was that maybe there are digital natives, younger generations, who are more attuned to the downside risk of new technologies. Maybe they're also concerned about future job prospects and what AI will mean for them. So there's a lot of ways to think about it, but it was an interesting discrepancy in the data that I think we can learn from.
Well, Yasmina, obviously your population is not 50 and under, more like 18 and under, but how are you at UNICEF kind of thinking about artificial intelligence and how it can be both helpful and harmful to the population you serve?
Yeah, so I'm not surprised by these results, actually, because we recently did a survey called Changing Childhood and with adults and children about various topics, including social media and digital technologies. And we noticed that 75% of young people get their news from the social media, whereas a much smaller percentage of those above 65 get it from the internet. So, but also the 75% of young people who get their news from the media, social media, only 23 actually trust this news. So the level of trust is pretty low among young people. So I would say that kind of is not surprising to me, perhaps because they are more attuned to the internet, they understand better what are the risks. And when it comes to artificial intelligence, obviously the risks that come out there when it comes to children is from the risk of bias, algorithmic discrimination, nudging techniques, profiling of children, and they're becoming increasingly aware of these risks and disinformation through generative AI now. It's even much harder to track. Data protection is another concern that young people have. And on the other positive note, there are so many opportunities that AI provides, and both in education, in health sector, in allowing children to express creatively, to play. There are so many ways where AI can actually help children and their futures. So I would agree that really the regulation that is democratic, not fragmented, that is right-centered is key to protect children from the negative influences, but also to provide them with these opportunities to thrive and to benefit from technology. So in UNICEF, we try to really look at the digital technologies in a very holistic way, where we look at both what opportunities these technologies can bring, but also risks, and making sure that really by reducing risks, we don't really curb some of the freedoms that are important for children as global citizens.
And Ria, you spoke about AI and how it might play a role in climate change, but maybe give us two, because I'm sure you could talk for hours, but maybe give us two or three other areas you're to keep you optimistic, 2 or 3 other areas where you see a potentially positive role for AI, and maybe also what you're worried about to bring you back to the rest of the group.
Absolutely. And Yasmina, you really touched on all the areas that I'm most excited about: education, health. There's some really exciting breakthroughs when it comes to health. And AI regulation is just increasingly a hot topic, so I'm really glad that the report dove deep into it. I mean, right now, this week at Davos, there's an AI house. There are panels happening every single day on AI, and I think for the next 10 years, we will continue to talk about what is the right way to regulate AI. And as Google CEO has said, as Sundar Pichai has said, AI is too important not to regulate, and not to regulate the right way, because it is so enormously beneficial. But we also have to recognize the risks of things that Yasmina has identified: disinformation and bias and security risks. Those are very real. And so that's why companies and organizations that are putting out AI applications like Google do have responsibility for having guardrails. And Google in 2018 put out our AI principles, which are kind of like internal rules that guide everything that we're working on that has to do with AI internally, or anything we put out externally. And governments also recognize this need for shared guardrails to address potential risks, but also to embrace the opportunities. And I think governments have a really big role to play. One of the big concerns is economic concerns. How will AI impact productivity? And governments can do a lot when it comes to things like supporting and funding digital skilling and education programs to ensure that no one is left behind in this new AI world. And we'll keep urging government officials to pay attention to the risks, but also ensure that we embrace these opportunities and pay attention to the kind of 2 sides of every policy issue, things like security and openness, data privacy, and also data access, explainability, and accuracy. And these are all issues that we're going to need to pay attention to very closely in the next 10 years.
Okay, we've got about maybe a minute or 2 before we're going to turn to questions from the audience. So if you haven't submitted a question, you want to, now's your time. But just one last one, and maybe we'll go to Yuri first, and then Yasmina will put you on the spot to defend all international institutions. But the survey found that many experts expect a multipolar world, but with weak institutions. These are the ones that are meant to provide guardrails for these competing centers of power, the survey forecasts. So I guess just to give you guys some numbers, only 25% have confidence in the UN and only 17% in the United Nations Security Council. Yuri, just give us a bit more insight into what you guys think is behind this very dim view of these institutions. And I know there were kind of mixed reviews about whether they'd be able to reform themselves. So give us your sense.
Yeah, we asked about 9 multilateral institutions, and we did find this findings on the UN, and specifically the UN Security Council, notable. And I think let's focus specifically on the UN Security Council, since there were literally 0 respondents who said it would be entirely capable of fulfilling its core mission in 10 years, and 17, as you mentioned, more like 17% who said somewhat capable. I think it is a reflection of people are watching. The war in Ukraine has been a good example of this, but the UN Security Council being kind of paralyzed to respond, and that also being the case on non-traditional threats like climate change or public health issues. I will say people were more optimistic when they thought that it could be reformed through new permanent members. India, Japan, Germany, as cited as the most likely candidates. So there was some hope, but I think people felt that it was dependent on reform. And one other thing I'll just point out quickly is that this wasn't the case for all institutions. So the World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and Group of 7 actually did pretty well, with more than 50% saying they somewhat agree that they'll be capable. So there were some institutions that looked like people had more confidence in them.
It's hard to be a diplomatic reporter and not, dump on some of these institutions. But Yasmina, now to give you the hard job, tell us a bit about how you think UN agencies like UNICEF can combat this perception that they're not up to the task of, helping to solve some of the world's problems.
Yeah, well, maybe first to say, I mean, it's true that there is a dissatisfaction with the multilateral system, and our analyses have shown that as well. And it's particularly coming also from the global south, because countries in the global south feel that they've been left behind. There's a lot of inequality still happening, starting with the response to COVID, to how these conflicts have been dealt with. But I just want to remind everybody that UN is actually a collection of member states, and it's a reflection of what is happening in the geopolitical sphere, and also the power struggles between and among different member states. So unless there is a willingness among the member states to collaborate, then it's going to be very hard for the UN system to come to any solutions on their own. But having said that, also the UN system was devised after the Second World War, and we live in a very different world now. And I think there's acute need to really modernize it and reform it. I think it's quite evident to many leaders in the UN system. The Secretary General's Our Common Agenda actually looks ahead to the future that has a more reformed networked multilateralism, where he's investing in capabilities like Foresight, for example, and risk analysis and prevention as a way forward. So I want to add on an optimistic note to say that I think we still need to believe in the UN system. If not UN, then who can really help us address the global issues and global problems? But we, on the other hand, hope to do everything we can in our power to really address these challenges. But we hope that also member states really abide by the norms and standards and values they subscribe to in all the various charters after the Second World War.
Okay, now we will turn to some audience questions. Yuri, maybe this first one is for you. This is from Jack Krupansky. He said, with what degree of confidence can you assess whether autocracy and authoritarianism, even in Western countries, will continue to ascend while democracy will continue to descend any number of years into the future?
It's a great question. I'm going to rely on the survey results for this one and turn to those rather than giving my own opinion. So we actually did ask, this wasn't in our write-up of the top findings, but we asked for 2 years in a row, when you look 10 years out, do you expect many more democracies, a few more, a few less, the same? And it was interesting. Most respondents either said it'll be the same number of democracies in 10 years, roughly, obviously, or a few fewer. So experts were predicting either kind of stasis or some democratic backsliding, or some kind of struggle around the margins in the middle, in the tug of war between autocracy and democracy. So it wasn't the rosiest outlook for democracy, and this is a huge year for democracy. I mean, 2024 is full of elections where we're gonna, this isn't gonna be a theoretical concept. We are gonna put this to the test around the world and see what the results are. But it also wasn't necessarily a forecast of a major democratic recession, which Freedom House and others have been tracking over the course of years. That didn't come through in the data either.
Before I pivot to another question, I wonder if either of you have any thoughts about this possible trend or democracy declining and how it informs some of your work.
Well, for our own analysis, we consulted young people. We have a group of youth Foresight fellows that we work with, and we asked them, choose any topic you would like to discuss, and they said democracy. So not climate, not conflict. So it was interesting for us because it showed that they're concerned, obviously. They're concerned about their role in kind of sustaining democracy and democratic institutions. They're concerned about being left out as well from these processes. But on the other hand, they are very hopeful and optimistic, and they wanted to see fairer results of the elections. They wanted to see more civic education, more engagement through various platforms and direct engagement. And this is where they mention technology as well that allows them to have this direct platform for engagement in democracy. So I think it is a space to watch. I think, as you said, Yuri, this year is going to show how many countries are going to come out to vote. But I also want to mention one thing that coming from Europe. European Parliament elections are happening in a month.
I believe so, yeah. Big topic for the FP.
Yeah, and 5 or 6 countries in Europe have actually lowered their voting age to 16.
Yeah.
So we're having a huge number of young people going out to vote for the first time. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what the results of these elections are.
You talked a little bit, Ria, about online freedom in the beginning. I would think that ties into some of this, if you want to say any more.
It just very much underscores the importance of freedom of information flows online and how this is key to a democratic process and to the electorate educating themselves, sharing information, and a strong opposition. We've seen YouTube being a great force for sharing journalism that is both localized and relevant in many countries where more traditional news sources have been completely shut down. And so it's important that the US government and other countries recognize that this is a source of democratization and kind of lift it for what it is.
This is a question from Will R., which I think builds on this a little bit. Any of you can jump in, but he says, seeing disinformation in social media, I'll paraphrase and say, in some instances leading directly to incitements of violence, how can you balance between online access and freedoms while also working to help prevent greater issues as tech continues to advance so rapidly?
Yeah, well, Google has very strong, and YouTube as a part of Google has very strong rules directly against incitement to violence, incitement to harm, and that those rules have expanded since COVID. So we've seen the definition of harm just even grow in terms of sharing false information on health and things like that. I think it's incredibly important for platforms to have these strong, steadfast internal rules and to recognize that it's difficult for some of the smaller companies to have these same standards and for governments to be able to support us all in that.
Maybe, Yuri, you could talk a little bit about the unease with social media that survey respondents have expressed. You said that it's quite negative, but anything more that you learned?
Yeah, I mean, it was 80%, I think around that, of respondents said that on balance, social media would be a negative have a negative impact on global affairs. And we asked this question last year, specifically about democracies, actually. And we said, do you expect it to have a positive or negative impact on democracy on balance? And I think at least over half said negative. So that does seem to be a consistent message across our surveys. Now, of course, one frustration as a survey maker is I want to ask a lot of follow-up questions about the specifics behind their answers, which we don't get to do. We have to pick only a few questions, but that was the general sentiment that was expressed.
Okay, this is a question from Joy Ofer of the Bellcrest Institute. And Maria, this might also be one for you to start with. She asks, in the context of climate change, which or what AI-driven strategies and innovations do you think will be essential for establishing a sustainable global future?
Oh, I actually think it's multiple strategies. It's all the strategies at once. We need all the help we can get to make changes internationally to have a more sustainable future. And that's putting information and power into individuals' hands, like I mentioned, through actual product changes that gives you choices like, can you choose to take flights that have lower emissions by just maybe changing the hour that you take off, but you still get there the same day? Everyone should have that information at their fingertips, freely available. But then also for private sector and for companies to make more sustainable choices, like can you choose between cloud providers that use 100% sustainable energy and make that decision when you're going through procurement intentionally, to the governmental levels and the city level to have insight into what is the best way to install traffic lights to make your own traffic patterns more efficient. And these are all examples that AI is making easier and cost-effective, and ways that you could use data that already exists and analyze it to become more sustainable. So let's do all of them at once, because this is really a crisis.
And Yasmina, I don't know if there's anything you're kind of seeing at UNICEF or any of the other UN agencies that you're considering here.
Well, absolutely. A lot of UN agencies are prioritizing and working on AI. And as you know, there's a high-level advisory research panel also that the Secretary General has put together. There's a lot of focus on AI in our own work, as I mentioned, through education, health, policy, research, and so on. But the area around linking AI and climate, green energy transition, these are important topics that we are just starting to look into. And they're going to have huge implications for children and young people with the future of their jobs. Also, how do we prepare them for this transition? How can they benefit from technology that provides healthier environments, whether it's in schools or in other places? So there's a huge potential really to look at AI and climate.
Here's a fun one for you, Yuri. This Christian Cabanis asks, borrowing a question from the super forecaster world, what information would convince you that your forecasts are wrong?
Interesting. No, I actually have been thinking, and we want to do more of this. I think it would be good to work into surveys in this package in future years, a kind of check on which, now obviously 10 years out, we can only do so much checking, but we also do, a forecast of top risks and opportunities in the year ahead. We talk about snow leopards, these underappreciated phenomena, and it would be good to kind of hold ourselves accountable year after year and look into and make as part of the exercise looking into which ones. I will say there have been a number that have borne out over the course of the past few years of this, and there have been some that haven't, and that's the nature of doing this work. But I think the exercise, and my colleagues in the Scowcroft Center who do Foresight are especially well positioned to answer this question, but part of the discipline is questioning your own assumptions and going back to first principles. And I think you need to look at your track record year after year. Not saying that you need to, knowing that you're not making predictions, as I mentioned earlier. So it is not necessarily like you're right or wrong, but really looking at how the forecasts have borne out and understanding how those lessons should factor into future forecasting. So it's a very good question.
I think we have time for just one more, and this one could really go to either of you, so you can decide who wants to go for it. Emeka from the Bellcrest Institute asks, do you think we need more regulation or less regulation when it comes to AI to better manage the next decade?
I love this question. A great question. And it also gets to the positive or negative impact of multipolarity, because right now we could see so many different efforts at AI regulation. There's, of course, the G7 International Code of Conduct. There's the UN AI Advisory Board. There's the Biden administration's executive order on AI and Europe's AI Act. And Google is involved in all of these. And through these efforts, you could start to see some coalescence on an international consensus on AI regulation. But no one wants a fractured regulatory environment. I think we've all mentioned that has negative impacts. It will make it harder to release advanced technologies in all regions. It makes it harder for startups to embrace. It'll push down good actors and allow bad actors to flourish. And so it's really important that we pay attention to this convergence. For example, the White House AI principles are really reflected as well in the G7, and that's really wonderful. But questions still remain that have been brought up by some of my co-panelists here today, which is what are the other actors who are missing from this? And we really need to make sure that low and middle income countries are part of this conversation. And so that could be the make or break to multipolarity there.
Okay, I think that is all the time we have. I hope you guys will check out the Global Foresight report online. It is fascinating. I spent a lot of time with it, and I recommend you do the same. And thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to our wonderful panelists.